his equipment and not wanting to buy a full line of tillage equipment and everything that went with that. Cut down on the number of tractors, started looking hard at no-till. The other part was, I've been no-tilling 13 years. My oldest daughter is 13 years. You start a family, there's less time available. I guess I didn't mention, I work full-time off that farm. So the 440 acres is evening and weekend occupation. I do hire harvesting, but I haul and dry all my corn, do all the other field operations myself. So really trying to minimize the amount of time I'm putting in the tractor seat, getting that work done while still being self-sufficient. We're big goals there. I think Joshua might have mentioned, some of those changes there's farmers that made that switch and really they just planted that way. They didn't look at it from a management standpoint. And I spent about a year investigating, trying some no-till beans before I jumped in with both feet and realized that switching to no-till was more than just adding attachments to a planter. It was, how am I going to change things? I had to change the way I did fertility. I had to change the way I tackled weeds and herbicide application because now winter annuals become a problem. Fertilizer, how am I getting some stuff out there earlier? Is banding versus broadcasting work? So it was much more than just adding a few attachments to a planter. It was really changing how I did things. Have seen some tremendous improvements in soil structure and tilth since making that change. I think that there's kind of two stories that come to mind. When I first made the switch, I was worried about headlands and causing compaction where we drove the grain cart in the trucks. So after the first year, I bought a small 3-shank inline ripper to do headlands in areas that would get compacted. Used that for probably 3 to 4 years. Then all of a sudden I noticed we really weren't packing down the headlands anymore, so I left them alone. And all of a sudden you notice that there's no different in the height of the crop, the yield monitor doesn't look any different. So that was a huge change. That I still have it in the shed, kind of with the hopes I'm going to pick up more acres and convert them over, and I'll need them for 3 years, but I haven't used that since, probably in the last 10 years or so. It's collecting dust and it has a lot of lumber sitting on top of it and miscellaneous parts. Kind of the other anecdote is a neighbor of mine sells farm machinery. He's a half mile down the road. He walks, particularly spring, summer, fall, down past our road. It was last year, 2017, we're struggling with a wet spring, and the one time I was kind of out in the yard and he walked by, came in the driveway and said, "Charlie, I've noticed that your fields don't have any puddles in them." And he says, "Is that because you've got channels and soil structure there and that's all going in? Well, everyone else who's worked their fields or planted their fields have all these puddles throughout." And I said, "Well, that's the theory on that." Obviously someone who's a little bit engaged in farming is noticing that as he's walking around and driving around the countryside, that soil structure has improved. I haven't cut a rut where I've had to go in with a disc and fix anything in probably 12 years. There's been that much change. As mentioned, 2013 is when I tried cover cropping for the first time, and I don't know if I'm really an earlier adopter. I don't have a necessarily program. I'm still kind of an experimental cover cropper. I've tried a lot of things. I haven't necessarily found the one thing I've liked. Started really simple and easily. I rented a pasture spreader, just fit on the 3-point of the tractor, went out and did 10 acres that way the first year. I wound up getting a catch. Also noticed that I had 20 feet was as far as I could spread, and that was even kind of marginal with annual ryegrass. And I had a lot of ryegrass growing in the whorls and collars of corn, because whatever moisture we got or whatever dew we would have would funnel down in there, and I had a bunch of seed that was hung up in the corn crop canopy, and for the longest time I had rye growing out of the collars of my corn. So I realized if I wanted to do interseeding, I needed to figure a way to get it down underneath the canopy. I've tried aerial seeding. There's now I think there's 2 or 3 groups, Tim and Rice County, that have kind of pooled together to do that. I've I've had some success, but also I've noticed it tends not always to be on target. I notice a little difference in the cocktails too, where there's strips where the radishes are heavier, the rye's heavier here, so it might separate out a little bit too as it's dropping down. The benefit of that though has been getting an earlier start on things. I've tried some drilling after soybeans, well, I haven't done after corn, I just haven't run into a fall where I've been willing to say I'm going to commit to putting cereal rye in after corn harvest. It just seems to get too late. In my area, the guys doing it after canning crops have had really good success with that though. So I keep playing around with things, built an interseeder. This will be the 4th season using it. Have struggled with getting broadleaves, brassicas, legumes to catch in interseeding. I've had great luck and success with annual ryegrass. 20 pounds an acre, I get a real wonderful stand. 15 pounds an acre, you're not going to get much. So those are a few of the other things. Herbicides, I continue to play around with that a little bit. I keep playing around with trying to get turnips and some of the other broadleaves to catch. Last year I kind of cut back, changed up my herbicide program on corn, and had some failures with cover crops because of that. So it might be kind of a rotational thing. Things I would like to do in the future, getting back to a little more fall drilling versus maybe the aerial seeding. I still haven't figured out the way I like cereal rye into corn to plant soybeans in the next year. That really seems to work very well. On the flip side of that, I prefer the annual ryegrass coming back into corn better, and that's a tough one to get established and get some growth when you're harvesting soybeans. I have tried interseeding into soybeans. I've done 5 acres twice, have not had success with it. I don't know, this year I might try going out really early and run the risk that it's gonna get overgrown and compete too much with the soybeans. So, welcome your questions, and I'll let Steve introduce Jerry.
Organic corn, edible black beans, so you can see it's a pretty diverse operation. Jared has been using practices like cover crop and mob grazing, stockpiling forage for winter grazing, and using a roller-crimper to improve the soil, suppress weeds, and turn a profit. So welcome, Jared.
Yeah, so thanks for letting me talk a little bit. You kind of took my whole spiel on what my farm is, so thanks for that. Jump on to the next one. Yeah, so my dad, John, and I farm in Goodhue. We raise organic crops and registered cattle that we sell bulls through Faribault Cattle Company. We've kind of, the farm is kind of, credit to my dad and my grandpa for a while ago, recognizing that things maybe needed to change. My dad went over to New Zealand and kind of saw how they were doing things there and worked on a grass dairy and kind of brought a lot of that stuff home and integrated it into the farm. And so for a long time they've been looking at things, how can we do things a little bit differently. For me it was a little different. I was maybe a little more stubborn or harder to budge. It took a little while. I used to just love working, sitting in a tractor and working, and I couldn't stand the cattle. Dad was probably nervous up until, for some reason the last year at college, there was an opportunity to buy a small herd of cattle, and I figured, well, we're gonna have cattle as part of the operation. I might as well start investing in something like this now and figuring it out a little better. And so I bought some cows and learned I loved it. Kind of as we started to work with the livestock and seeing the impacts of livestock on the land and how livestock can really integrate well with crops and rotating fields into forages for cattle can allow you to take land out of crops and still make a profit on it and still get those added benefits in the soil. When I first got those cows really and saw how those things worked, it really started to shift my mind. And so I went from just wanting to sit in a tractor to really diving into this, and I started going to conferences, going to books, or reading books, watching YouTube videos, and things like that, and really kind of just changed at that point. Some of the hopes and the goals, I wrote down these before he talked about them, actually aligned perfectly kind of with what he was talking about, the 3 different aspects of holistic management with social, the people, the finances, and the land and our assets. I wrote down like some of the goals that we're focusing on our farm is to, 1, reduce our costs, and primarily in our winter feeding, With the livestock, as anyone who has livestock know, feeding through the winter is extremely expensive. All the equipment costs, machinery costs, and things like that. And in the northern winter here in Minnesota, it can be difficult to do, but we're trying to focus on how we can graze longer, how we can reduce our expenses there. Another thing is building soil health. I never used to understand that, and then I could see the difference in the land with cattle and with the different cover crops and different practices that we were implementing on our farm, and so that became a main goal for me and our farm. And lastly, to improve work-life balance. My grandpa and dad built a successful farm out of a lot of work, and I like good hard work and stuff too, but I knew that as a younger person wanting to come back to farm, I wanted to make life and family life a priority in my future as well. And so we've been trying to figure out how in our operation we can reduce the workload that's required on the operation. And so some of the things that we've tried on our farm to go along with those goals have been full season grazing cover crops. That's been a huge, a really cool thing to see on our farm. For those of you who know, like perennial forages tend to have 60% of their growth in the early season in May and June. And then they slump down in the summer slump and a little bit of growth in the fall, and that can be really difficult when you have all this grass in the spring and you don't know what to do with it in the late summer, and you still got to feed your cows through the winter. And so you can either A, make hay, which is a lot of expensive, or very expensive, or you can B, just stockpile it or graze faster to get through it. But what we've kind of been doing is trying to use sorghum sedan grass primarily as a warm season annual to kind of push production back later in the season. So while we're grazing this massive, the spring flush of grass in the spring, our warm season annuals like sorghum sedan and stuff are growing, and then all that production is available in the late summer that we can graze and allow our perennial pastures to stockpile again for winter grazing. Some of the things we've seen through this, we've been able to extend our grazing season significantly. Where most people are grazing until October or so, we've been able to graze the last 3 years into the end of December, first 2 weeks of January. And so 2 or 3 months of savings on feeding hay is a lot of money saved and a lot of labor saved. Also, it's a lot less acres that we have to make hay on, which in our busy season, in the spring and summer when we're cultivating our crops, is extremely advantageous. And also what we experienced this year, what we saw on the acres that we had planted to sorghum last year were some of the best weed suppression that we had on all the grounds. Weeds being organic is a big issue, and so the year following sorghum sedan grass, we had a lot less weed pressure on that land. And also we've just found that the sorghum sedan leaves the ground and it really just jumpstarts that, getting that land in the soil aggregation that you look for and that you want in land. It really makes it mellow and soft, and we just were really impressed with how that works. And another thing that was good about sorghum sedan for winter grazing, that it stands up in the snow a little bit better than that fescue or the pastures that our pastures are, which is beneficial for grazing late into the winter. Another thing that we tried that kind of worked with this system well, as we try to graze later in the winter, the quality of the forage gets a little better, or gets a little worse. And so when you have lower quality forage and calving in January, February, March, you need to feed something else to get them the nutrition they need in that last trimester. But we moved our calving back to May, and so now we can graze late into the winter despite the poor quality forage that's still there for grazing. And as well as we've been able to significantly reduce our calving time labor, which has been really nice. The lifestyle in the spring for calving, from keeping a shed bedded down and cows fed and moving calves out and keeping them healthy in the mud of March, to being able to calve out on pasture and just going out and checking and seeing there's a new calf. The cow walks off by itself, calves, and life's gotten a lot better with that switch to calving in May. Another thing that we've tried is no-till soybeans by roller-crimping, or planting it into standing rye and then roller-crimping the rye. We did that. The yields weren't quite as good as we had hoped, but we're optimistic and hoping to continue trying that. A few things that we want to continue to try and work on in the future is working with local crop farmers who maybe see the advantages of integrating cover crops, but don't really want to deal with the livestock work. Working with them possibly to find a mutually beneficial way of getting our livestock and them giving us the ability to graze longer in the season. They can have the benefits of that livestock impact, and we can have the benefits of their land, essentially, and the ability to graze longer. Something we've done recently is really analyzed our cost of feeding every day, a cost per cow during the winter versus a cost on hay versus grazing forage, and analyzing those costs and figuring out how we can best, the cheapest way to raise cattle and get them through the winter. And then another thing that's kind of been sparked in my mind's interest to potentially do sometime in the future was reading Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. Really got me thinking about diversifying our livestock species and how can we, stack enterprises to add profit to the farm and also improve the soil in a little bit different way. So yeah, that's a little bit about us. Thanks.
Matt and his family raised corn, soybeans, and cover crops in Faribault County near the town of Blue Earth. And Matt is interseeding a multi-species mix into standing corn and fall planting a hairy vetch-triticale mix following soybeans. Welcome, Matt.
Cut the lights a little bit, maybe? Alright, we'll go stand behind the table so I can hide. You can see the screen that way. Thank you. Yeah, we farm, we're strictly just corn and soybeans at this point. I farm with my father-in-law, his wife, and then my wife and our 2 boys. We've been strip tilling since '09, and we've been using covers since 13. And I'm like a little kid, I like lots of pictures, so that's what mine is. I threw some pictures in and cheated. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're doing and what we've seen. So the first one, planting green, no-till into soybeans. This was aerially seeded in the fall, 40 pounds of rye. I know that sounds light. We like to stay light on our rates. I feel a heavy rate, you can get into trouble with, you might not get it dry out, you don't get sunlight down on the ground, and you don't get air movement through your canopy. We like to spray, I basically chase the planter with a sprayer. This was sprayed immediately, and so there's just the progression. The 13th was planted. The 19th, you can see the beans poking through, and there's the 27th spraying a post. Strictly a Roundup program on this because this weed suppression was phenomenal with the thatch of rye there. Wouldn't have probably had to spray a post at all, but we had some drowned out spots. Again, this is our first year doing it, so we did spray a post just to be safe. A couple things you can see on the left, these were some roots I dug. This was just 20 yards apart. The left hand was no-till where we had rye, and the right hand was strictly no-till. You can see all the extra roots and the extra root biomass you've got there with the rye. The rye roots essentially did our tillage for us, and the soybean roots were able to follow those channels and use that. And then another thing that sticks out is the nodulation, how much more nodules there are. So a heavy nitrogen using grass crop ahead of a legume like soybean makes a lot of agronomic sense. We're pulling up nitrogen that otherwise would be leaving our system and our water and who knows where, not in good forms. We want to hold that and use that in plant form and keep it in our system so it's something we don't have to buy down the road. And then there's a lot of variables that depend on when that will get released back to us, but a good chunk of that is going to be come back into the system right around reproduction flower time, which is when we really want it for determining yield in soybeans. I'll try and keep chugging along here. The next one I'm going to talk about is the interseeding I did. This was done on the 5th. I got a grant from the Minnesota Corn Growers, the Innovation Grant. That's our side dress rig we use. So we side dressed and interseeded simultaneously there. We're blowing seed. So that unit has a lead coulter where the 32 is injected directly behind that. And we blew seed back and kind of in between the containment coulters you see there. So we got some good, we got some soil mixing with our seed there. Don't necessarily like the amount of disturbance the machine does, but it's a very efficient way of applying nitrogen, and also the ground disturbance actually gives us very good germination for our cover crop seeds. So what we did is I seeded at V3 in corn, V5 in corn, and I sprayed no post herbicide application where I did that, because that's one of the huge issues with early interseeding especially is that post herbicide. So I said, why do we need it? Because what I've heard, weeds are a symptom, and bare soil is why we have weeds. So let's put something there that we want there, that is a species that will complement and not harm. So we'll cover it with species we want. So and then we had, this was replicated, we had a control for each, and each control was just our standard full pre-emerge and post-emerge applications with no cover crops. So here's just progression. The 24th, you can see we have buckwheat, cowpeas, annual rye, and we have 3 brassica species. The buckwheat, I really like buckwheat in the interseeding. It is not shade tolerant whatsoever, but if you're using it for a weed smother, again, it depends on your goals. That's how we need to design what cover crops we want to use. But buckwheat is great at smothering weeds, and it reached, when it was seeded at V3, it bloomed before it went down. So like the 7th there, we're starting to get to full canopy. The buckwheat was knee-high, and it was blooming. So in my mind, any cover crop we get that's reached maturity and is blooming, that's all the good you want out of it, because we don't want it to go to seed. Excuse me. So there you can see the 7th, and that's about the time the buckwheat started slowly dying from the shade. The cowpeas and the annual rye did very well under the canopy. There's August 24th, you can see what's left, and then October 6th, we've got annual rye left after our first frost, and that's about it. Cowpeas, first sign of frost, they're gone. Cowpeas did have a few nodules on them, was an interesting observation. And then, so the numbers from this, see if I missed anything. Okay, so the average yield at V3 was 219.5, V5 was 224.8, and the control was 220. So in both cases, our interseed was either equal to or better than our controls, which is contrary to what you would think normally. So here's how the dollars break down. Our post-emerge herbicide that year was 2.5 ounces of Status, 24 ounces of Power Max, and I used $7 for an application fee. That's $19.68 an acre. We got 4.5 bushel increase from interseeding at $3.50 corn. That's $15.75. That's $35.43. We were ahead on the acres that we interseeded and sprayed no post. Now we've got $20.50 for a seed mix cost. That was the cost of our interseed mix we used. So we were ahead almost $15 an acre, and we're getting all the benefits. We're introducing diversity into our system, and we're not using man-made inputs in the form of chemicals that way. Now I own a sprayer, so this wasn't the best news, but it's something I am hoping to continue this next year and get multiple years of data before we take it large scale. These were 80-foot strips replicated twice, and then I'm hoping to do it again next year. And then hopefully, if I see multiple years, the numbers will go full scale with this. And then we did 4 other replications across the whole farm. That was more like the V6 time where we interseeded, and we saw on average a 1.12 bushel increase. Never ever saw a decrease in yield from interseeding. Saw the opposite actually. Okay, are we okay on time?
Okay, yep.
Okay, I'll keep trying to move here. This is what we've done ahead of corn. We've struggled getting a cover ahead of corn, so after soybeans going into corn, what we've done is we've planted 1-3 and 1-4 soybeans where we wanted to have covers ahead of corn, and we've planted them in 15-inch rows because it's the planter we had. I'd ideally like to have twin rows, but 15 is what we have available, and we indexed our strips. So we're planting and stripping directly between the two 15-inch rows, and you can see pictures of it there. So there's the spring. This was this spring, and obviously we had snow 10 days before we were planting this year. It wasn't ideal for cover crop growth, even cereal rye. We didn't get a lot of biomass this year, but I was still encouraged because everyone told me hairy vetch isn't going to overwinter. It's not worth your time, and I'm too stubborn. I wanted to try it anyways because I really wanted something to lower my seed-to-N ratio ahead of corn. So we're putting the vetch in there, and I'm using trit because I feel like trit has a little lower seed-to-N ratio than rye. With the wheat cross in there, it lowers that seed-to-N ratio a little bit. It's a little more leafy and not quite so stemmy. So here's what the trit and the vetch looked like. And those were the nodules we got, even with the growth on the vetch this year. Didn't get much growth because of the cool spring, and we still got nodules like that, which I was pretty impressed with, which led me to, we did the same thing this year. We planted immediately following the combine, and then stripped it immediately afterwards. So we'll see how it works this year. Okay, a couple of the paybacks we've seen. So all this is great, but what does it give us? Structure. And one thing, if you're going to try, I would recommend trying cereal rye, but don't just strictly look at the yield monitor when you want to see benefits. you will immediately see some of this the first year with cereal rye. Your structure will be greatly improved. You get that cottage cheese, that crumbly soil, and it dig roots. You gotta dig if you wanna see what covers can actually do. This is a story of infiltration. This is a pond or a pothole, and with all the rain we had this year, it drowned out. So we planted seed that was laying around in the shed end of July, and so after we took our soybeans off, we had 4 inches of rain, 10 days, 2 weeks probably ahead of this, and my father-in-law said, you're probably gonna have to stay out of there, it's probably gonna be wet. And I went in there, and it was like chocolate cake. The soil was dry, and it crumbled. It did not smear. It was unbelievable to me. I was blown away at the texture and how the water just disappeared. Whether it's a good thing or not, tile doesn't work unless the water can get to it, okay? So it's got to infiltrate first if we want our tile to work. And covers just make water just disappear. It's unbelievable. We had combine tracks, grain cart tracks through here, and normally where that happens, we won't get uniform strips. You won't get the berm because it's been packed down. But here where we had covers, and it didn't matter. The strips were uniform, didn't matter where the combine was. And that's just some of the things that we would like to see whole scale across our farm eventually. Weed control, if I've got any time left. This is from this spring. I got rained out spraying 50 acres on a field. I didn't get a pre on. The right side, maybe you can't see it, but there's little weeds emerging everywhere. So it's an area that got washed out again with a pond, washed all the residue over, and so there was hardly any cover over here, and weeds were just coming like mad. And on the left is our normal where we stripped and planted, and I couldn't hardly find a weed that had emerged yet, and it was simply because we had cover, we had trash there, we had residue, armor, I guess I should say. So cover the soil. The soil wants to be covered. That's how it works. It wants roots. That's how it functions. It needs roots to have carbon to function. Another weed control example. This is where we had a boundary issue with a planter. 2 rows didn't get planted on the outside of a field. And so with that interseeder, it kind of congregates the strips of seed in between the rows. So this would have been a corn row, but it didn't get planted. And you can see the pigweed, water hemp is just thick in there. And even though we don't have a perfect stand of covers here, it's greatly reduced. So put a plant there and prevent the one that Mother Nature will use to fill the void. Okay, that's it.